History likes to hide behind numbers. We use them to make sense of things that our minds cannot actually process. But sometimes, a number is so large that it stops being a statistic and starts being a scream. The year was 1487. The place was Tenochtitlan. If you were standing on the shores of Lake Texcoco during those 4 days, you wouldn't have seen the water. You would have seen people. Thousands of them. A line of human beings that stretched from the heart of the city, out across the massive stone causeways, and disappeared into the horizon of the surrounding mountains. They weren't tourists. They weren't merchants. They were captives. The Aztecs recorded the number themselves. They were proud of it. They wanted the world to know. 84,000 people. Stop for a second. Think about that number. 84,000 lives in 96 hours. Modern historians argue about this constantly. They sit in comfortable offices and say it's impossible. They say the logistics don't work. They say it was propaganda, a story told to scare enemies. Some say the real number was 20,000. Some say it was lower. Others, looking at the sheer scale of the ruins and the depth of the skull racks, say the number might have been higher. But here's the thing. The number doesn't actually matter. Whether it was 80,000 or 8,000, no one disputes why they were there. No one disputes what happened to them. And no one disputes that for 4 days, the great temple of Tenochtitlan became the busiest place on the planet. You think you've seen this before. You've seen Apocalypto. You remember the cinematic version. The wild chase through the jungle. The dirty, screaming prisoners being dragged by their hair. The chaotic, bloody mess at the top of a pyramid while a crowd of thousands screams for blood. That version is designed for a 2-hour theater experience. It's built for excitement. It's built for speed. But the real Aztec system? It wasn't built for speed. It was built for something much more terrifying: precision. The 84,000 people standing in those lines in 1487 weren't part of a riot. They were part of a schedule. They had been processed. They had been counted. Most of them knew exactly where they were going, because the Great Temple was 45 meters high. It was the tallest thing in their world. You could see it from miles away. You could see the stairs. You could see that those stairs weren't gray or white. They were dark. They were stained with the permanent, dried residue of what had been happening there for decades. For most of those 84,000, the end was fast. A climb, a stone altar, a knife made of volcanic glass, a heart removed while it was still trying to beat, and then a body tumbling down the steps. Simple, efficient, brutal. But as the priests looked down at the lines stretching into the distance, they weren't just looking for victims. They were looking for something else. They were looking for the perfect ones. While the mass sacrifice was happening at the top of the temple, a small group of men was being pulled out of the line. They weren't being saved. They were being selected. These men didn't look like the others. They didn't collapse in fear. They didn't beg. They had a specific composure, a symmetry to their bodies, a way of standing that suggested they weren't just warriors. They were something divine. These men weren't sent to the knife. Not yet. They were sent to the Karmakak, the schools of the priests. What happened to them there is the part of history most people never hear. Because while killing a man is easy, turning a man into a god takes time. And the Aztecs had all the time in the world. Stay with us till the end for valuable insights. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. The priests didn't just want bodies. They wanted perfection. While the mass of 84,000 captives was being funneled toward the Great Temple, a logistical operation so vast it clogged the city's arteries, a smaller, quieter process was happening in the shadows of the stone walls. This was the selection. This was the moment where the linguistic DNA of the Aztec Empire shifted from simple warfare to high-level psychological engineering. The men pulled from the lines weren't chosen by accident. The priests who stood at the gates of the Karmakak, the elite schools for the nobility and the clergy, had been trained for years to spot a specific kind of human being. They weren't looking for the strongest brute or the loudest shouter. They were looking for symmetry. They were looking for skin without a single blemish. They were looking for a way of walking that didn't falter even when the smell of copper and old blood was thick enough to taste. If a captive showed fear, he was sent to the stairs. If he pleaded, he was sent to the stairs. But if he stood there, watching the horror with a cold, steady gaze, if his body was balanced and his face was correct according to their ancient proportions, he was pulled aside. To the rest of the 84,000, this might have looked like a miracle, a reprieve, a chance to live. But in reality, it was the beginning of a transformation that no modern mind can fully grasp. These men were taken into the Karmakak, and the first thing the priests did was strip them, not just of their clothes, but of their history. Every captive had a story. They had a village. They had a mother. They had a name given to them by people who loved them. In the Karmakak, that name was erased. It was deleted from the record of the living. The war paint of their enemy tribes was scrubbed from their skin with abrasive stones and sacred water. Their hair, matted with the dust of the march, was washed and cut into a specific, holy style. They were being prepared to become an Oxyptla. In our language, we might translate that as an actor or a representative. But to the Aztecs, translation is a lie. An Oxyptla wasn't playing a god. Through a series of rituals, physical modifications, and constant psychological pressure, the captive became the god. Literally, physically, legally. Think about the pressure of that environment. You are a prisoner of war. You expect to die. Instead, you are taken into a silent, stone room. You are fed the finest food the empire can produce, food that even the warriors who captured you aren't allowed to touch. You are dressed in gold, not cheap trinkets, but heavy, polished ornaments that catch the light of the sun. You are given expensive flutes made of clay and told to play music. You are given 4 beautiful companions who are told to treat you as a husband and a deity. When you walk out into the streets of Tenochtitlan, the very people who cheered for your capture now fall to their knees. They don't see a prisoner. They see Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror. They see the creator of the world. They bring you their children to be blessed. They touch your skin as if it were made of starlight. But there is a catch. There is always a catch in a system built on precision. The priests are always watching. They aren't watching to see if you try to run. Where would you go? You are on an island. Every bridge is guarded by elite jaguar warriors. Every boat belongs to the state. No, they are watching your eyes. They are watching to see if you still remember who you used to be. Because for the ritual to work, for the sun to keep moving and the corn to keep growing, the god cannot be forced to the altar. The god has to choose to die. This was the ultimate psychological trap. The Aztecs didn't just want to kill their enemies. They wanted to colonize their souls. They wanted a man to spend a year living in such luxury, such worship, and such isolation from his former life that by the time the festival date arrived, he had forgotten he was a slave. He had become the mask. But as the days turned into months, and the flute songs echoed through the stone halls of the Karmakak, the calendar was always ticking. In the modern world, we understand the concept of a role. An actor plays a part, takes off the costume, and goes home. But the Aztec mind did not function this way. To them, there was no costume. There was only reality. When the selected captive entered the Karmakak, he wasn't just being trained. He was being hollowed out. The priests were experts in human behavior. They knew that if you change a man's clothes, you change his posture. If you change his food, you change his energy. If you change the way thousands of people look at him, you change his soul. The captive chosen to become Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, lived a life of unimaginable luxury for 1 full year. Think about the psychological warfare of that. One day you are a soldier in a muddy field, fighting for your life. The next, you are draped in gold. You are given a retinue of 8 servants who anticipate your every breath. You are given 4 wives, each chosen for her beauty and her lineage, who treat you with the reverence due to a creator. You walk through the streets of the greatest city in the Americas. People don't just move out of your way, they collapse. They press their faces into the dust. They offer you incense. They bring you their sick children, believing that one touch from your hand is the difference between life and death. You are taught to play the flute, not just to play it, but to play it with a haunting, divine beauty. You walk through the night markets, the sound of your music signaling to everyone that a god is passing by. But beneath the gold and the flowers, the system was cold. The priests were not your friends. They were your handlers. They monitored your heaviness. That was their term for it. They watched to see if the human inside was starting to reappear. If you looked too sad, if you looked like you wanted to run, the ritual was failing. They needed you to stay in the divine zone. Why? Because the Aztec universe was built on a terrifying logic. The gods sacrificed themselves to create the world, so man must sacrifice the gods to keep it going. If you were the Oxyptla, you were the battery for the sun. If you climbed the temple steps screaming and fighting, the battery was broken. The sun might not come up. The rain might turn to blood. The entire social fabric of millions of people rested on your ability to walk to your own death with a smile on your face. This is the linguistic DNA of a high-functioning cult of state. It wasn't about cruelty. Cruelty is personal. This was structural. The Aztecs invested a year of resources into one man. They fed him the best corn, the finest cocoa, the rarest meats. They gave him gold that could have bought a village. They did all of this just to destroy him. Why build a god just to break him? Because the higher you build something, the more powerful its fall becomes. To the Aztecs, killing a slave was a minor act. But killing a god, that was an explosion of spiritual energy. As the months passed, the captive would see the great temple every single day. He would see the smoke rising from the altars. He would hear the drums. He knew the festival calendar. He knew that when the month of Tenochtitlan arrived, his time was up. Some accounts say that in the final weeks, the Oxyptla would stop eating. They would stop playing the flute. They would look out over the lake at the mountains they once called home. The priests called this the growing heavy. They didn't offer comfort. They offered more incense. They offered more gold. They were fattening a soul for the harvest. And then, the day arrived. The wives were taken away. The servants were dismissed. The gold was stripped, piece by piece. The god was gone. What was left was a man, standing at the bottom of a staircase, holding nothing but a handful of clay flutes. The crowd was silent. Thousands of people watched from the plaza. There were no guards pushing him, no ropes pulling him. He began to climb. When the captive reached the base of the great temple on the final day, the world changed. The luxury of the past year was gone. The gold ornaments had been taken back by the priests. The 4 wives had been sent away. The fine food had been replaced by the iron taste of fear. But the system didn't use chains. It used something stronger, expectation. As he stood at the bottom of those 365 steps, the captive held a series of small, clay flutes in his hands. These were the same instruments he had used to enchant the city for months. They were the voice of the god. Now, they were the markers of his end. He began to climb. Every step he took was a step away from the earth and a step toward the sun. And on every single step, he did something that historians still struggle to explain. He took one of his flutes, raised it to the sky, and smashed it against the stone. Crack! The sound echoed across the silent plaza. Thousands of people stood below, watching. They weren't cheering. They weren't jeering. They were witnessing a god breaking himself into pieces. Crack! One flute for his youth. One for his strength. One for the wives he would never see again. One for the home he had forgotten. By the time he reached the top, his hands were empty. He had destroyed everything that made him a god. He had stripped himself of his own divinity. What stood at the top of the temple was no longer Tezcatlipoca. It was just a man. A tired, hollowed-out man with nowhere left to go. The priests were waiting. They didn't look like men anymore. They wore black robes stained with the residue of thousands of previous services. Their hair was matted with dried blood, never washed, forming thick, heavy cords that smelled of decay. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The man lay down on the sacrificial stone, the Tecatl. This is the part where the cinema version gets it wrong. In the movies, there is a struggle. There is screaming. But in the real version, the most terrifying part was the silence. The captive had been reprogrammed so deeply over the last 12 months that he didn't fight. He offered his chest to the sky. The high priest raised a knife of black obsidian. This wasn't a metal blade. It didn't slice. It shattered its way through the ribcage. It was a jagged, volcanic glass that was sharper than any modern scalpel. In one swift movement, the chest was opened. The heart was removed while it was still pulsing, still trying to do its job, still unaware that the body it belonged to was finished. The priest held it up to the sun. The living image had been returned to the source. Then, the body was rolled down the steps. It didn't fall gracefully. It tumbled. It bounced off the sharp edges of the stone stairs, a broken doll that had served its purpose. At the bottom, the warrior who had originally captured this man a year ago was waiting. This was his prize. He would take the body, and the processing would enter its final, most macabre stage. But while this one god was falling, the 84,000 others were still waiting in line. Not everyone was chosen to be a god. Most were just fuel. And for those who weren't beautiful enough, or calm enough, or perfect enough to be Tezcatlipoca, the Aztecs had a different kind of theater. They had a game where the rules were written in blood, and the equipment was designed to fail. If the Ixiptla was a tragedy written in gold, the Tlacaxapehualiztli, the festival of the flaying of men, was a horror story written in public. Imagine a massive, circular stone. It is carved with symbols of the sun and the earth, resting in the center of a plaza surrounded by thousands of spectators. This is the Tenochtitlan. To the average observer, it looks like a stage for a duel. But this was not a duel. It was a slaughter disguised as a sport. A captive would be brought to this stone. He wasn't dressed in gold. He wasn't worshipped. He was tethered. A sturdy rope was tied around his waist and anchored to the center of the stone. He had enough room to move, to dodge, to strike, but he could never leave the circle. He was a prisoner of the radius. Then, the priest would hand him a weapon, a macuahuitl. This was the signature weapon of the Aztec world, a wooden club with grooves along the edges. In a real battle, those grooves were filled with razor-sharp obsidian blades capable of decapitating a horse. But for the man on the stone, the obsidian had been removed. In its place, the priests had glued bird feathers. Think about the psychological weight of that moment. You are standing on a stone. Your waist is tied. You look at your weapon, and it is a toy. It has the weight of a club, but the edge of a pillow. It is a prop designed to give the crowd the illusion of a fight, without giving you the means to win it. Then, the opponents emerged. These weren't random soldiers. They were eagle and jaguar warriors, the special forces of the Aztec Empire. They were men who had survived dozens of battles. They were armored in padded cotton and animal skins, and their weapons were real. Their obsidian was fresh. Their edges were black and hungry. They didn't all attack at once. That would be too quick. They came one by one. The captive was expected to fight. In fact, the crowd wanted him to fight. If he curled into a ball and cried, the ritual was considered a failure. It was boring. But if he swung that feathered club, if he used his broken, tethered body to parry and strike, the crowd would roar. Why? Because a strong enemy makes for a better story. If the captive fought well, it proved that the Aztec warriors who originally caught him were even stronger. His resistance didn't threaten the system, it validated it. There is one story that survives from the Spanish records, the story of a warrior named Tlahuicol. He was a Tlaxcalan general, a man of such legendary strength that when he was captured, the Aztec emperor himself offered him a choice: become a commander in the Aztec army, or go to the stone. Tlahuicol chose the stone. He refused to lead the men who had captured him. He refused the mercy of his enemies. He stepped onto the Temalacatl, felt the rope tighten around his waist, and picked up the feathered club. The accounts say he fought for hours. He didn't just defend himself. He wounded 4 elite jaguar warriors. He broke their armor with a weapon made of feathers and wood. He turned a staged execution into a legitimate battle. The crowd was in a frenzy. They were watching a man defy the linguistic DNA of the empire. But the system is designed to win. Always. When Tlahuicol grew tired, when his breath became a rasp and his arms turned to lead, the 5th warrior stepped in. A fresh man against an exhausted one. A real blade against a wooden one. Tlahuicol fell, not because he wasn't the better fighter, but because the machine he was fighting didn't have a win condition for the prisoner. The ritual ended the same way every time. The heart was removed. The skin was taken. And the message was sent to the visiting dignitaries watching from the front rows. Your best men are nothing more than entertainment for our gods. We often look at the Aztecs and see a death cult. We see a civilization obsessed with the end of life. But if you look closer at the linguistic DNA of their society, you see something much more sophisticated. You see infrastructure. The 84,000 people who stood in line in 1487 were not victims of a random act of violence. They were the raw material for a political engine. The Aztec Empire, the Triple Alliance, did not function like the Roman Empire or the British Empire. They didn't want to conquer you, tax you, and turn you into an Aztec citizen. That would have been a logistical failure. If everyone is an Aztec, who is left to be the god? Who is left to be the captive on the stone? This created a state of managed conflict. The Aztecs purposefully left enemy states like Tlaxcala and Cholula unconquered. They sat right on their borders, strong enough to fight but not strong enough to win. This was the system of the Xochiayotl, the Flower Wars. These weren't wars for land. They were appointments. Messengers would be sent to an enemy city, not to demand surrender, but to schedule a battle. They would agree on a date, a field, and a number of warriors. And the rule was simple: do not kill. Capture. The entire social ladder of Tenochtitlan was built on this one metric. You didn't become a noble by being smart or rich. You became a noble by how many living, breathing men you could drag off a battlefield. If you killed your enemy, you failed. You wasted the resource. A dead man couldn't be dressed in gold. A dead man couldn't play the flute. A dead man couldn't feed the heaviness of the gods. When the Spanish arrived in 1519, they saw the tzompantli, the skull racks. Thousands of heads organized in perfect rows and columns. To the Spanish, it was hell. To the Aztecs, it was a filing cabinet. It was proof that the system was working. But every machine has a breaking point. The Aztecs' greatest strength was their need for permanent enemies. But that was also their fatal flaw. For generations, they had used the Tlaxcalans as a human farm. They had taken their sons, their fathers, and their captains, and they had turned them into public theater. They had made them climb the steps. They had made them fight with feathers. When Hernan Cortés marched toward Tenochtitlan, he didn't win because of his 500 steel swords or his horses. He won because he found thousands of people who were tired of being processed. The Tlaxcalans didn't join the Spanish because they loved the cross or the King of Spain. They joined because they wanted the machine to stop. They wanted a world where a man was just a man, not a living image waiting for a calendar date. In the end, the system consumed itself. The very rituals designed to show Aztec power, the 84,000 captives, the gold-draped gods, the feathered blades, were the things that ensured their neighbors would fight until the city was nothing but rubble in a lake. You think you know this story because you've seen the movies. You've seen the savages and the heroes. But the reality is much darker. It wasn't about being primitive. It was about being too organized. It was about a civilization that figured out how to turn the human soul into a cog in a clock, and then forgot how to turn the clock off. The Great Temple is gone now. The 365 steps are buried under the streets of modern Mexico City. But the DNA remains. It reminds us that the most dangerous thing in history isn't a man with a knife. It's a system that has already decided what you are worth before you even arrive. If you enjoy dark, untold history, subscribe because we uncover what others won't.